Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of Not Another Demo, brought to you by the fantastic folks at the Cloud Security Alliance of Michigan. Today's is distinguished. I almost extinguished. That would have been embarrassing. You're not extinguished. We don't want you to be extinguished. Well, unless you get on fire. Distinguished guest, we have Michael Leland from McAfee and also Jerry Matt, Sales Engineer, Solution Architect Extraordinaire. Michael, do you want to talk about a little bit about yourself and what you do for McAfee?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So I joined the organization by way of an acquisition. I was a CTO for Nitro Security before we got acquired by McAfee in 2011, I guess. So if you add up my Nitro Security years, and by the way, Nitro Security was the SIM technology, security information event management platform that was acquired by McAfee to give them a footprint in the security operations arena. So we add up my Nitro years to my McAfee years to my brief stint with Intel Security. Remember when we rebranded ourselves under Intel, and back to my new McAfee years, I think it's going on 16. And in that capacity, you know, when I moved over from Nitro, I became the chief technical strategist for McAfee, which just meant I got to look at the entire portfolio and figure out how it advantaged or had challenges in certain areas for our customers. And then most recently also took on the role of tech director, global tech director for security operations. So anything throughout the McAfee portfolio that deals with SecOps, whether that's a customer buying our endpoint solution and our web gateway and realizing that all of that information needs to find some way back to the hands of somebody who's going to put it to use. The telemetry from it, you know, being used for investigations or triage or correlation as part of an analytics engine. So I handle all things SecOps for McAfee.
No pressure there.
Did you hear how he said SIM and then actually, you know,
did the
said out what it was? So
you warned me ahead of time. Acronyms were bad. I will take that to heart.
And you know what? I bet we have actually said SIM 20 times, and that's the one we have.
That's one we forget about.
So
yeah.
Well done, Michael. You're teaching us now. So.
It's good because SIM is dead.
Oh
no, we got to cut that out.
We're going to have to dive into that one a little bit.
Yeah, let's do a little bit deeper dive.
No, thank you for joining us. As you know, with Not Another Demo, we kind of try and keep everything like a casual conversation, talk about relevant topics. And one of the things about McAfee is, you know, you joked a little bit about Intel, but with McAfee always drives some sort of reaction from people, right? Like it's, you know, it's a great product to use it. Oh, you guys have been around forever. Or holy cow, what's up with the guy that's attached to the name of the company? You know, those kind of things. We'll start off with a fun thing before we talk into some more serious topics. What's one of the crazier things that's happened to you since you joined McAfee?
So it's funny you mentioned the fact that we are constantly referred back to the namesake of our company, John McAfee. The three questions I almost always get when I talk to a customer, the first one is, how is John? And I'm like, you've got to be kidding. Like, first of all, we're not on a first name basis anyway. He left the organization, you know, close to 2 decades ago. Of course, he still sues us every year for his namesake and loses. But the second question I almost always get is, you guys are just the antivirus company, right? And that's the perception is that that's all we do, right? That we're just our grandfather's AV. And then the last question, which really, really bothers me, is, when are you going to start doing machine learning? which tells me that we've not done a great job as an organization of letting customers know, letting the industry know what we've been up to, what our innovation pipeline has been doing, what our research and development has been up to, and you know, it's no secret we've been doing it for, you know, over 6 years. What was most interesting for me to learn in the organization is how much we leverage our consumer business, right? And that is that we're always focusing on the IT security side, the enterprise business, and as we get back to the question of machine learning, you know, ML only gets better with the larger sample size you can feed it, right? So you feed it a very large test set, and it can make better determinations about unknowns. That's the the value and the advantage of ML. So imagine a company like McAfee that has a couple 100 million consumer customers, all feeding telemetry into our ML data lake. And the nice thing about consumers is they click on everything. So we get a lot of learnings from that, and it's the result of all of those learnings that feed into improving the machine learning and the AI we use for our enterprise customers, so we get a better sense for what the adversaries are doing. Now, the adversaries are going to be going after consumers a little differently than they're going to go after a bank or a healthcare organization. We realize that, but you can still learn a great deal about tactics, techniques, and procedures when they're being detonated in an environment like my grandmother's, who has no idea what endpoint security means and just knows that she clicked the button that says, yes, please install something called AV.
So let's jump into the hot topics right now. We'll start with the one that it's going to take a while for us to go through. And I really think it's relevant to a company like McAfee for the exact stuff that you talked about with machine learning, UEBA, and all, some words that are not really marketing terms or marketing slogans, but actually can really help with stuff. The Twitter hack and social engineering. So what are your thoughts around, first of all, how could something like that happen to a giant company like Twitter? And secondly, how does a company like McAfee learn from that, especially because considering all the data that you have access to that might help prevent something like that in the future?
That's a great question, a really good, timely topic. If I could say one thing before all else, two-factor authentication solves so much of this. But that said, even the current adversarial campaigns that hit Twitter, bypass some of that or got around it because of the access to the tools that they gained. Not too dissimilar from the attack a few years ago where they got access to the NSA tools, right? So once you have insider knowledge about what companies and technologies are being used by those companies to provide levels of protection or administration, the admin side of tools, you learn a lot. Social engineering is a hard one because no matter how much technology and process you put, the weakest link is always the people, right? We are by nature too trusting. We want to help people when we can, and that leads us to make bad decisions about anything as simple as accepting a call from somebody that claims to be the IT admin that needs to do something on your machine and needs admin privileges or request access. It actually, what's interesting to me is what we're doing now with what's called GAN, which is generative adversarial networks. This is adversarial machine learning, effectively understanding how the bad guys are using ML so we can build better ML to counteract their ML. It's a cat and mouse game, as you know. We're constantly playing leapfrog, but one of the things we're doing in the AI side of things is actually doing things like deepfake recognition. So deepfakes are an interesting part of social engineering, specifically when you look at things like Google's AI and a few others that can emulate pretty effectively natural speech language. You actually think you're talking to the CFO who's asking you to wire funds to somebody because it has to be done right now. And for all all it takes is a couple of recorded sentences fed into an ML engine and then somebody to type out what they want it to be said. And all of a sudden you sound like the CFO and you're gathering that information from speeches you acquired off the web from a simple Google search. So it becomes really important that we validate, what information we're getting and who we believe we're getting it from to protect ourselves from that side of social engineering, because it's all too easy right now to stand up a domain too quickly, to fire off a quick email asking somebody to visit this domain. You're impersonating somebody that you automatically trust because he's within your organization. You've spoofed the email domain header, and all of a sudden it looks like it came from your CFO. So of course you're going to click on something, or leave to somebody that's in sales and receive something like, here's an invoice, I'd like to acquire this. Here's a purchase order, and it's a PDF. Right? Of course, a sales guy is going to open a PDF that says, I'd like to order something. Here's my purchase order. That's what he does.
Jerry may or may not have done that in his time.
Hey,
So
hey.
along those lines then, because this ties into a couple different things. I've heard some of the people, response has been all over the place. Oh, they could have done this. They could have done this. Obviously, it's like a week into this. So, everybody can assume what they want. One of the suggestions that as a possible protection in the future was around maybe like a second, not like a human two-factor authenticating, so to speak. So, you have the one-time passwords and stuff like that. But if it's that high profile of an account, could a company like McAfee do a secondary alert, goes to your SIM wherever, and that goes to some sort of, IM solution that says, hey, before you inside come in and log in and make changes to this, you have to get like some sort of manual verification from like another human being. Is that too far down the road for UEBA, or are those types of scenarios something that McAfee is considering?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the techniques used for authentication with a technology like UEBA, because they're really two different ends of the spectrum. One is the requirement or request to gain access. The other is the analytics of the accesses that have been gained, right? And I think the important thing is UEBA tends to be a post-mortem response, looking at logs and behaviors to try to interpret if the attempted access or permitted access is something that is consistent with that user's behavior. So whether it's inconsistent for his peer group, whether it's something he doesn't always do and so shouldn't be doing it now, whether it's something like we call superhuman behavior, which is a login from one geography followed very quickly by a login in a second geography. We call them Superman events. No one could be in two places at the same time. So it's analyzing those things that are important. And then you've got also the behavioral things of ML that look at things like volumetric. How much data is normally transferred? How often does this person normally do this? There are some interesting ones right now that actually monitor things like keyboard behaviors and typing patterns, and try to interpret whether or not the person sitting in front of the typewriter or keyboard is the person who is expected to be delivering that message.
Interesting.
And those things are pretty cool. It's
Pretty cool,
not too dissimilar to what a CAPTCHA does now about trying to trace your mouse movements and browser history or browser behavior. All those things feed into the ML model that help us try to determine the authenticity of the person who's providing that access request.
Yeah, because it could be something as simple as tying into, if it's coming from like a mobile device. I'm trying to think like a bad guy, right? Okay, I'm going to be able to get around geographical restrictions because I'm going to jump into a VPN. I'm going to say I'm in Atlanta, even though I'm in Macedonia or, Lithuania or something. So I've gotten that geolocation thing taken care of. But again, maybe it's coming from a laptop where, Bill Gates 9 out of 10 times is doing a post from his mobile device. So these are the things where I really think, companies that have access to the larger data pools, like you said, like a McAfee, really, really can, help with that stuff. So that leads in kind of the next question. Are you seeing, everybody talks about CSAWMI, right? Lloyd's been beating his head up, against the wall for the last couple of years, trying to get, even our healthcare system to understand we really, really got to get our head around CSAWMI. Is this something to where you can use CSAWMI behavior even to feed into that SIM to make decisions?
Absolutely. So one of the things we found with our migration into cloud. So first of all, I ask customers all the time, how comfortable they are moving their infrastructure to cloud. And if you had asked me 5 or 10 years ago if we would see banks and healthcare organizations feeding information into the cloud, or even SCADA network environments like industrial control, nuclear regulatory body, those types of things, those guys, would have told me 10 years ago, no. 5 years ago would have said, probably not, unless it evolves into a much more secure environment. We learned a lot from COVID, and that is you can do a lot working from home when you never thought you'd be able to enable home workers. So it's taught us a few things. One, it taught us not every organization was ready to have a mobile workforce of this volume and capacity. Two, we also learned that it can be a tremendous advantage and cost savings to the employee and the enterprise hosting it. But it also highlighted the fact that the data itself may not be ready to move there. So I asked customers all the time, I would start the conversation with, how cloud friendly are you? Or are you nephophobic? And they're like, what? So nephophobia is the fear of clouds.
I'll have to remember that one. Awesome.
In all honesty, it's the fear of a cloud falling on you, which I don't quite know how to grasp that. Maybe it's fog. But anyway, but I would ask customers if they're nephophobic or if they're cloud friendly. And those customers that told me absolutely not, cloud is not in our future, have definitely had a change of heart. Now, what we're finding too is that many new services are only being offered as SaaS cloud-based offerings. So even if you didn't want to, somebody like a Workday is going to say, if you want our HR system, it's entirely cloud-based offering. If you want Salesforce now, you're not putting a Salesforce server in your environment. You're doing it through a cloud-based offering. So we have to learn and help our customers learn to make that transition effectively and smoothly. And the benefit that we saw with CASB is when you can start providing security through the access layer of a single sign-on, of a SAML environment, you're almost guaranteed to have user identity tokenized information inside of every session. SIM, by contrast, only about 10% of the data in SIM had user identity associated with it, right? You consume a million events from your firewall, all said source IP, dest IP, source port, dest port, message. A simple syslog feed. You don't get identity in that.
Nope.
You might from an Active Directory feed, you might from things that authenticate over NTLM or something else, but at the end of the day, the bulk of your events don't have user identity, so user behavioral analytics in a SIM has limited value. But on the flip side, everything or 90% of everything that goes through a single sign-on or a SAML authentication practice within a website or a SaaS offering, the minute you log in, right, two-factor authentication becomes your new perimeter, right?
Yep.
You're gaining access to a service, an application, and the minute you authenticate successfully, your tokenized identity follows you through your entire session till you log out. So I now have a terrific source of information that has been tagged with user identity, on top of which I can now run my user behavioral analytics. When we acquired a CASB technology, one of the key features of it was that it already had the UBA engine built into it. We weren't going to try to add that context later on. It was actually part of, exactly. There's about a dozen open source UBA rules, right? The analytics that go into user behavior analytics. You can do a lot more on top of them, but we picked one that did those plus a handful more, and we've gotten terrific value. Now that becomes a new feed into our SIM. So now you've got the telemetry and the value of cloud analytics that are now feeding into your prem analytics. And then, if you up level that one more step, you've now got SIM and cloud data. The last thing you need is really a ton of endpoint telemetry, and you've got kind of all three pieces of that puzzle. And that's really EDR.
Yep. So speaking of EDR, what an endpoint? The fact that everybody talks about, okay, the standard firewall is gone. You don't have to worry about moat stuff. The endpoint is, the user becomes the endpoint, all these different marketing slogans. But at the end of the day, there still is the ability for people to interact with those devices like your mobile phone. What are some of the things that McAfee is doing, or maybe McAfee needs to do? Remember, because this is a casual, honest conversation, to allow it to, you trust that mobile device more, because everybody talks about zero trust and everything else. Well, you're still a person, right? You still have this to some certain extent. You have to trust this. And what are some of the things that you can do to make it so, yes, it could be an Android device, it could be, jailbreak iPhone, but still you're using something that it's may not inherently be secure, but you still have to trust it. Does that make sense?
It does. And it also highlights one more challenge with all this work from home is BYOD has exploded. right? Because now it's not just that I'm not going to take my iPad to work with me. That's my home device. Now all of a sudden, your kids are on the iPad, you're on the laptop that you got from a COE machine at work, and then you've also got this need for a mobile device. And all of a sudden, you've got multiple things that you might just pick up at any given point in time and say, I need to check my email, or I need to download a file or view a PDF that my boss just sent me. And now all of a sudden, you've got this technology sprawl across the number of devices that could potentially gain access to critical or sensitive data from your organization. So it's no longer just, I know my COE laptop is protected, and I know the MDM solution that pushed a policy down to my mobile phone has me protected. I've got to now worry about every other potential device that I might pick up while wandering around the house and check my email. So,
and by BYOD, you meant bring your own disaster? Is that what you're?
Yeah. So it became a big challenge with the new work from home methodology. What we did is we decided we needed to not replace, but play nicely with all of the mobile device management vendors, the MDMs, right? And rather than recreate the wheel, let's work with everybody, whether that's Intune or anybody else, and make sure that we could integrate the policies. The next thing we did is we partnered with, partnered with a technology vendor called Zimperium. And Zimperium became one of the pillars of what we call mVision. And it's the mVision mobile technology that allows us to deploy not only scanning capability on the endpoint, but also maintain a list of which applications are authorized. And then lastly, because everything's been policy or moderated with a policy pushed out by MDM, you've still got that concept of an isolated encryption container, that everything that you do inside the mobile device is kept inside of an encryption layer. Even if I go to take a file, copy out of my Outlook for iOS and paste it into, let's say, a Gmail, that won't happen, because it says, no, you've removed it from the enclave that we're allowing you to operate in. You've taken potentially sensitive data and moved it outside of the scope or purview of this. So effectively, it pushes DLP-like context down to the endpoints. Now you've got application protection, because we're going to scan them and make sure they're not malicious apps. You've got data protection, because we're not going to let you copy data out of one protected enclave and put it somewhere else that may not have that same level of protection. And the most important thing comes back to telemetry. Everything you do on a device through which you're accessing sensitive or company data generates event telemetry that gets fed back into a common data lake.
So how does McAfee tie this all together? Does XDR or Cortex come into play, or what are we doing to be able to get that visibility and see it inside of all this?
So I take offense at you calling it Cortex. It's not our technology. It's another vendor. But let's just say XDR as a generic term. So for those of you that have not heard the term, EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. XDR officially stands for Extended Detection and Response, or by some analysts' definition, cross-platform detection and response. And what it really means is EDRs are network blind, SIMs are endpoint blind, and the best way to kind of merge those two together is to make available data from both of those platforms into a common layer, maybe a data lake or other ways of getting access to it, on top of which you can then run better analytics and correlation. So for vendors like McAfee and other platform vendors like the one that makes the technology you described, it really is this new merge of EDR plus SIM plus orchestration plus really anything that vendor can bring to bear, right? If you have DLP technology, that becomes part of the data lake on top of which we can analyze behavior and actions. If you happen to have an IPS in your portfolio, sure, that data and the net flow data all makes its way into the data lake and can be analyzed by a common layer of analytics and correlation. So XDR is really nothing more than EDR and SIM on steroids.
Network traffic as well can get fed into that, right? From
absolutely. In fact, some of the best behavioral analytics models right now are volumetric models based on net flow that you only get from the session data. So you get application information, you get source depth and volume of traffic. You can actually do low and slow attacks determined that way based on things like CNCs that are just infrequently pinging, but on a pretty steady, regular basis. those are the kind of things that can be seen with network-based attacks or network-based analytics. And the nice thing about network analytics too is it crosses the chasm over to the industrial control side of things, where you're not going to be able to install an agent on an industrial control sensor on a PLC or a Modbus device. You're not going to install anything that has a footprint. So all you've got is traffic analysis. And from that, you can do passive fingerprinting of both device technology as well as adversarial behaviors. You can see a lot from that. So for us, flow data and network behavioral analytics is a big piece of our XDR story as well.
Okay. So the XDR that shall not be named, I think it's important to make that distinction because some people might confuse that. But I'm a manager, I'm a lead engineer, and I really want my uplines director, VP, whoever that is, to really take a look at McAfee. What are some of the things that I could do in that position to really get them to take a look at this?
So there's two things that I like to talk about now when it comes to security operations and understanding the value of a platform vendor like McAfee. And the first of which is, it comes back to the analytics side of things, the 25 to 30 years of history that we have in collecting telemetry, gathering that information, building machine learning models. And then what we're doing now is we're actually curating that threat intelligence back to our customers to give them what they've never had before, and that is visibility into campaigns that are not yet touching the customer, but that the customer might be in the path of. So think back to when you see the news and a hurricane's coming ashore, and you get that nice big trajectory that says this is the area that is in the path of this storm. Imagine from a security practitioner's perspective, you had that same level of visibility that said, we see campaigns that were started 2 or 3 weeks ago. We've been tracking them up until now, and we see them heading your direction. They're going after others in your geo. They're targeting other people in your vertical. Or there's specific telemetry that we're able to see that tells us that they are targeting maybe executives within your ranks. So now we have information that says you're in the path. That's the prediction side. But imagine if you could be proactive and determine, based upon what your configuration looks like right now, and based upon the understanding we have of the adversarial's TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, if we can marry those two together and say, we know what the bad guys are going to do. We know the way you're currently configured. Can we tell you if there's a gap that says that these current techniques could be stopped by the protections you have if only you tuned it a certain way? I like analogies, and I always show people a picture of a stereo equalizer. And sometimes I jokingly call it a hi-fi equalizer, for those of you that are old enough to remember what that is.
Yep.
It's a device that's as wide as your stereo was, and it's got 40 or 60 little levers. And what you would have to do is you'd have to set them in a certain way for the outcome you were expecting based upon the given
music,
use
yeah.
case. Exactly. You had a setting for opera and a setting for jazz and a setting for rock and roll. And if you were like me, you probably had little notches marked in, or you used fingernail polish to keep those settings. You go back and retune them as you needed to. The problem I feel with the security industry as a whole is we've gotten so complex that no one knows what the proper settings need to be A, most effective without B, having too many false positives so that you don't impact normal business, right? You can go all in and set everything super high and have a huge high false positive rate, which then impacts normal business use because you're not only blocking malicious, you're also blocking benign.
Mm-hmm.
So you want this fine balance between the right amount of security with the least amount of friction. So our goal with this AI technology is, if we could marry up what we know the campaign's going to do with what we know our technology can do, and we know that if only you set it to be this, this, and this, you'd be protected from this campaign, we take the guesswork out and we give you prescriptive assistance with exactly how to use the products you have. Now, right now, it's an endpoint technology focus. We're going to tell you how your endpoint should be configured, but going forward, we'll be able to tell you how your web gateways should be configured, how your CASB should be configured, how your IPSs should be configured. And our whole goal is to be as as proactive and prescriptive as possible so we can take the guesswork out of security operations.
So which brings up a good point, because in the NIST webinars just in, they were talking about that manufacturer data and how manufacturers need to start understanding, like, almost like, what's the data set, right? Like, this is the data that can give you, this is only, this is like default behavior, because I think what it can do, like with especially like IoT and ICS and OT protection is it sets that baseline, right? Because then you're already starting from a point of, it's tuned to this. Then you use UAB and other things to build into it, because I think we ultimately want to get to a point where, with more and more automation, can it do X, Y, and Z outside of the norm, be put in a quarantine where it can still only give that data, but you kind of clamp down on the access. I mean, there's the story where, back in the day, endpoint data, well, if this was compromised, hey, let's just let it only connect to, Outlook to get emails, right? Like, it can't do anything else. Yep. Maybe we take that old school thought and apply it to IoT devices and mobile devices like this, and combine it with the power they have with like XDR and the ML stuff. I mean, can we get to that point anytime soon, or do you still think it's kind of a pie in the sky?
I think you raised a good point, and that is IoT will see that level of sophistication sooner, because I think they're more amenable to an architecture of zero trust, right? And that is because they're in protected enclaves. It's very well understood what should happen between, let's say, a PLC and the historian database, or the controller and its maintenance machine. So it's really easy to say, this is what's expected between two Modbus devices or between two DNP3 systems. And it's very easy to also lock down and say nothing else outside of that should be allowed to happen, right? I think healthcare first coined the term trust but verify. Wasn't that some of the early high trust stuff?
Yep.
And so the issue was, you couldn't prevent something from happening. You had to let it happen and worry about it later and figure out if it was good or bad. Because the last thing you want to do is deny something that has to happen between, your MRI imaging system and the patient, or whatever that connection is.
Yep.
You didn't want to stop that from happening. You just want to keep close eye on it and then go back and later and undo it if you needed to. I think in the IoT space, or at least in industrial control and SCADA spaces, it's easier to determine what normal has to be, and anything outside that is either completely restricted and unpermitted, or is kept to a bare minimum, where it has to be authorized to allow it to happen. Similar to use what is the technology in Microsoft that if you need to install an application, it pops up with UAC.
Oh yeah, UAC.
User access control. So the problem with those things is, who doesn't just click yes, right? We've just been accustomed to pushing things out of the way that become annoyances to us. And every time it pops up, you're like, well, of course I asked to do that. I'm gonna say yes. It's only when it pops up when you didn't click something that you're gonna question and say, wait a minute, I didn't really expect PowerShell to run just by opening this Word document. And then you realize, oh, it had a macro embedded, and that kicked off a command shell, which then kicked off PowerShell for a live off the land attack. That might be unusual to me. And so because I didn't ask for that to happen, I'm more aware of it. So that might be helpful. The other thing we've learned is that people's behavior or reaction to these things from a security operations perspective is, in a perfect world, you'd let the attacker live off the land a little longer, so you could perceive what he or interpret what he does,
find out what they're doing.
Sure, but who's going to allow their entire enterprise workstation realm to be honeypots? right? It's just not what we do. So the first thing you do is you stop the action. If you can't clean the device or clean the behavior, what do? You re-image, right? We've gotten so accustomed to just wipe and replace. And so a lot of the data that we would have had access to in the past as practitioners, the snapshotting of that equipment before it gets re-imaged is critical, because now you can still have all of the information about what happened leading up to and during an attack, and then you just simply wipe it and let the let the employee get back to work, but you now have his image, right? Similar to taking an end case snapshot, we have a technology that takes a snapshot of a moment in time. And if you add all of our historical telemetry with what happened leading up to that time, followed by the snapshot of what the machine looks like at that very moment, once you have that, you can let them wipe the machine, re-image it, put it back out there in a clean state and go at it. But we still have the ability to go back and troubleshoot and find the root cause and determine what happened leading up to it so we can prevent that behavior from going on in the future.
Yeah, we actually had a situation where we work, and Lloyd's familiar with this, where we actually had to have our tech support team understand that, hey, before you do any of this, right? Because if they got stuck and they're like, oh, this is crazy, this is too hard, we're wipe it and give it back to you. And to your point, security's like, oh, whoa, my gosh, there's so much important data in there.
Yeah.
That's the loaner laptops have become a thing in the information security space, right? Because like, okay, don't do anything with it, unplug it, shut it down. Here's your loaner laptop, get that thing right over to our SOC so they can look into it. So you bring up a good point. I know we're slowly bumping up against our time frame here. Does this mean that like phone, tablet manufacturers like Apple and Android, should they start expanding the idea of like, I'll just use Apple for example. So Apple's got the bionic chip, right? So this is where health data and other data lives, and it's a secure enclave in your thought. They're thinking about it for just this important part of information that's being generated here. I could actually argue they could expand that more to have more functionality for like McAfee and others to be able to do critical stuff inside that, right? So a lot of people that maybe, for people that aren't developers, and I only know this because I used to be a developer, with Apple, with like fingerprinting and FaceTiming, how it works is it stores that information, only stays there, and the only information that Apple allows out is a true or false. So I have my banking app, I access the Face ID. The only information that chip responds with is true or false. So think about how that important that is, right? That whole interaction, everybody's like, oh my God, Apple's got all this and this. And they may secretly have that, right? But again, you have to have some trust. But
right.
At least for the purposes I've seen it with applications interacting with it, it's just a true or false. So taking the idea of that secure enclave and expand it out any more, I think there's a lot of power in companies like McAfee and others being able to do more secure stuff and having more management of that data inside that. Do you think that's a pipe dream?
I don't. Surprisingly, one of the key reasons given for why Intel would have wanted to own a company like McAfee back when that decision was made was they thought that you could embed more security into the silicon. That never played out in its reality. Or at the very least, they realized it was so hard to do at the time, and a company like Intel has a development cycle that takes 2 to 4 years to get a new piece of silicon out, and security is adapting and evolving quarter by quarter, month by month, that it just couldn't keep pace. So I think that it does make sense to think about putting more tech into custom ASICs or silicon like that, like the Bionic chip. But I think you're right. I think the idea of keeping more data in enclaves and only allowing data out that's been fully sanitized is an interesting concept that we should be thinking about as a security community. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I will come back to the people problem, and that is all the technology you put in front of people. If you don't make it easy, they're going to go around it, and so it has to be enforced and not just designed and deployed. My definition of shelfware is not just a product you buy and don't install. It's a product you buy, install, and don't fully utilize, don't train properly on, don't keep upgraded or updated. All these things still become a problem. And that's where the people problem come in is they're using outdated technology. They're using technology that took 3 months to POC, 6 months to roll out, and it's already outdated.
Which gives me into a whole point around like sales and everything else. Do we really need to think about even vendor sales differently, right? Like, if it's so much that Matt and I have seen this, I know Lloyd has seen it too, where you get that initial sell, you sell the customer on stuff, and then you move on to the next thing. How can you bake in the incentives? Because from your point, from a tech point of view, you need that relationship data, let's call it, right? Is because you want to be able to get to the right people and get that information. And if, if they're sour, if they're sold on something that's like alpha technology or beta technology, then they're going to be less apt. And the stuff that you're really diving deep into with XDR and UV and everything else, I really think the relationships are hugely important.
They are, and I'll be the first to tell you, not every customer is the right audience for every discussion of product we have, right? It just isn't. Customers make decisions for a number of different reasons. Some of them are political, some of them are technical, some of them are financial, right? And never once have I met a customer that says, yes, I'd like everything you have from your menu, please, right? It's going to be you having to work with others for various reasons. I mentioned, I started my days at Cabletron. This is going back a good 20 plus years. I remember the days when the customer had a problem, they'd invite all of the vendors in, and you'd all meet in a conference room, and you would leave your vendor hat at the door. And the only thing that matters was building the right technical solution for the customer. And then the SEs in the room didn't care whether that was your technology that offered it, that somebody else's technology, we had to partner with this guy, we don't have that piece, you do. But at the end of the day, if the outcome was beneficial to the customer, then it was a positive outcome for every vendor sitting around that table. And I feel sometimes like we've lost that a little bit, and every vendor feels that they need to acquire as much of the deal as possible. And even if it's not appropriate for that sale, I don't believe that's the right way to build a relationship with a customer. I don't want to be a vendor. I want to be a partner if I can. And that means being honest about what works and what doesn't, what is necessary and what isn't. And when we need to tip our hat and say, look, this is not our area of expertise, but we've got partners who we can bring in that help you with that, or here's a competitor that's better at that piece of it, and we'll work on the API integrations to make it all seamless. I think that's the responsibility of a security vendor these days, is working with our customers and not against our competitors.
I can actually
say, that is the soapbox on which we, the CSA here stands all the time, right, is having things be done that way, right, versus the kind of traditional grab everything sales pitch like you talked about. So we're going to make this probably one of our longest not another demos ever, but I do have to hold you accountable for something that you said early in this that we never circled back around to, and that is that SIM is dead.
I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Then you proceeded to mention SIM about 28 times after you said it was dead. So I want to circle back around with you on that one and have you explain what you meant by SIM is dead, when apparently we're still using it a lot.
So thank you for giving me the chance to clarify my response. It used to be, my response has changed a little bit. It used to be SIM is dead, long live SecOps. Then it was SIM is dead, long live SOPA, which is the security orchestration automation platform architecture, a design that ESG built. And now it's SIM is dead, long live XDR. But as you heard, one of XDR's biggest components is SIM, to get third-party data. My point in saying SIM is dead is I think a number of customers have become disillusioned with a standalone single-purpose SIM solution, where it has been oversold and underdelivered, that the use cases either were not properly defined or poorly implemented, and people think that it's just a money suck, that they keep feeding more and more money into it. They're not getting the same value out of it they expected. You had vendors show up that decided to go about it by picking a single use case. And maybe that use case was user behavioral analytics. And so there are vendors out there that decided, if I could just answer that use case really, really well, I don't have to call myself a SIM. I can call myself a security analytics platform. And in that case, I will be able to talk to the SIM consumer as well as the security analytics and SecOps guy. And what we've always found is that the best defined SIM deployments are ones where the use cases were well known up front. They determined the data sources required to address those use cases. They onboard those data sources, they build the correlation rules, they prove that the use case works, and they rinse and repeat. And those are the proper SIM deployments that are successful. But so many of them were just throw all the data into a big bucket and figure out what to do with it later. And those customers are disillusioned. So I think SIM was too hard, is challenging to operationalize. The quicker you can get it to a cloud offering and not have to do it yourself on your own equipment on premises is going to be to your advantage. And ultimately realize that the SIMs you've been putting in are still valuable because they still hold the telemetry from third-party data that needs to make its way into an XDR data lake, and that's where it'll happen. SIM is not dead as a technology. As a single-purpose standalone function, though, in security operations, it's going to have to marry itself with EDR. It's going to have to marry itself with SOAR, security orchestration, automation, and response.
Thank you.
It's going to have to marry itself with a few other things for you to get the full value out of SIM.
Does that make you happy, man?
It does. Perfect answer. And I would also like to give Aaron the award today for most acronyms of any of us by far that he didn't explain, but I'm not going to hold him to that one because I cut this off at some point.
That's true. That's true. Like I gotta eat my own dog food, so to speak. All right, we do have to wind it up. We're getting close to the top of the hour. I guess we'll end this on a positive note. What thing are you most excited for in these times? Like, I mean, it's definitely weird, right? We have the pandemic, we have the way overdue racial injustice stuff. We have politics I just want to hurt both sides. Like, things are just a little out of control. We need to reset. But in all this, like you said, innovation is happening. What's making you most excited?
I think the excitement that I get out of seeing, this is going to sound crazy.
Crazy's good.
I think the technology advancements that are being made in support of the new work environment are both creating challenges that have to be solved by security, but the advantage is they're getting solved by some pretty innovative technologies, right? And I'm pretty excited about zero trust. I'm pretty excited about better analytics that we're seeing more and more come our way. The research being done, right? The best part about analytics is I can do it from home as well as I can do it in an office, and you've got a ton of college people, kids that are not going back to class but are still sitting around hacking away at R or Python or something and coming up with some pretty cool models. And the open source community is thriving right now on getting contributions and forks of code to make it more interesting. The challenge, of course, is that every time you do that, you're potentially opening up more security holes you're gonna have to fix later, because not everyone has the same prowess of coding as the rest. But the advantage of having it being crowdsourced like that is the number of minds feeding into it are incredible. We crowdsource a ton of threat intelligence as well from our customers, from partners, and seeing the amount of intelligence coming in to build our new ML is pretty impressive.
Excellent. Well, thank you very, very much for talking to us today, and you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate the time.